Okay, while we're waiting for the last few people to join, we will get started with a couple of announcements. So first up, obviously ASHG is coming up at the start of November. ClinGen will be having a luncheon on the Thursday there, so on the 7th of November. We're not having a booth or anything this year, but we do have this lunch event. You do need to RSVP for it. The link to RSVP through will be up on the ClinGen website shortly, that link that's there, and we can also put that in the chat. But noting that the RSVP link isn't active yet, so make sure to check back for that soon. But obviously anyone who's involved in the ClinGen community in any capacity is very welcome to RSVP and attend that meeting. And in fact, we encourage you to do so. We'd love to see you there. And also at that link that Kazan just shared, there's information about some of the other ClinGen activities at ASHG as well. So our platform presentations and our poster presentations. And then before we get into the topic for today, just to note, when we meet again at the end of this month, we'll be having an overview and updates from the actionability workgroup as well, which I don't think we've heard from for a little bit. So I'm really excited to hear what they've been up to of late. But with that, our participant numbers seem to have stabilized. So I think we can get into the topic for today. So today we're joined by Heidi Rehm, who I feel needs no introduction really, but amongst the many hats that she wears, she is also one of the PIs of the ClinGen resource, and it's in that capacity that she's going to be presenting an update today on ClinGen's Curation of ClinVar project. So with that, I will hand over to Heidi.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Alicia. And just one insight to Alicia's comment. I think we've settled on the topic for that ASHG luncheon, which will start out with a brief update from ClinGen, but then turn over to roundtable discussions to get input from the community on ClinGen's own priorities and future directions. So if you want to influence that, come and be fed and give your thoughts. So a little insight to that. But with that, I shall share my screen for the topic today. Okay, can you guys see the ClinGen Curation of ClinVar screen?
Yes.
Great. And I don't think these slides should take up the whole time for sure. So feel free to ask questions along the way, and Alicia or anyone else, if you see questions in the chat that I don't see, let me know. Happy to stop. But with that, I will kick us off. Okay, so this project we call ClinGen's Curation of ClinVar, sometimes abbreviated CVC, even though that doesn't quite match the letters. So the background, as I'm sure all of you know, I mean, ClinGen has received over 4.5 million records over 11 years, a lot of content. And NCBI at NLM developed ClinVar as a data archive. It never intended to pass judgment on the accuracy of the classifications, nor review them over time. And no one could manage to do that for 4.5 million records. But there have been, increasing requests over time to sort of clean up ClinVar, to get rid of incorrect classifications, especially as people want to use the database at scale, as opposed to, one interpretation at a time where we all kind of go in there and ignore certain things that are clearly outdated. But if you're trying to use this resource at scale, then you really want to have it be accurate as much as possible. And we even in our survey, 76% of respondents, felt this was absolutely essential, very important work to sort of improve the accuracy of what's in ClinVar. And just so that we're all clear on what we're trying to do with this project. So for those of you who use ClinVar all the time, at the top of the record is that overall calculated classification that ClinVar calculates, and it's based on the aggregation of all of the records. And so this is the sort of at the top, the aggregate classification, which is impacted by submitter status. So as some of you know, the review status of any given record, which you can see is indicated by these stars. So most individual submitters are 1-star submissions, whereas expert panels are 3 stars. And then there's a small number of submitters that are in the 0-star category, meaning they don't necessarily have a systematic classification approach. They don't necessarily agree to share their evidence. To be a 1-star submitter, you either have to share your evidence, have a systematic approach that's put with your submission, as well as be willing to be contacted to provide evidence if you haven't included it. So, so when that classification is calculated, if there are any 1-star submissions, it's pulling from those and ignoring 0-star. But if there are no 1-star, then it will pull from the 0-star. And then, of course, if there are 3-star expert panel submissions, they will override the others. So it's a calculated classification based on those submissions and pulling in based on star level. But as many of you are aware, there's a fair number of records that are in conflict in ClinVar. So that overall record, as you can see here, which says conflicting classifications of pathogenicity, and then it'll show you, oh, there's 1 likely path, 1 VUS, and 5 likely benigns. You have some sense from the top as to what's contributing to that conflict. If you look overall in ClinVar, about 1% of the records are what we sometimes call medically significant conflicts, where one lab has called it path likely path, and another submitter has called it either VUS likely benign or benign. If you also then include the VUS versus benign likely benign conflicts, that's another 4%. And then there's the confidence conflicts, likely path versus path, or likely benign versus benign, most of which none of us pay much attention to. So those are sort of the categories of conflicting variants and how many are in ClinVar in those categories. So this project was really, its goal was to create an efficient mechanism to improve the accuracy of content in ClinVar. Obviously, having our expert panels review variants and resolve these conflicts is the ideal, but for all of you involved in expert panels, you know that that's a long process that requires a lot of work on the Biocurator side, time to present to experts, discussion and decision making, maybe reaching out to the submitters to get their evidence, et cetera. So it's a lot of work that goes into that. And so we're trying to come up with, is there, if you just look and there's 40 labs that say pathogenic and 1 lab from 10 years ago that says VUS, of course, just get rid of that VUS, right? So we're, really targeting what can we do very efficiently that doesn't require a whole expert panel process. So the goal was to create a joint workflow with ClinVar. This project's been done in collaboration with ClinVar. We have our own ClinGen curators are reviewing the records, the SCV, the submissions through a prioritization process. And then the goal is to have these problematic SCVs flagged so that they're excluded from that overall classification. But just because that classification may be out of date or inaccurate doesn't mean the evidence sitting in that record is not of use. And so our goal is to allow these records to remain visible in case they have evidence, or to be aware that a lab has seen a variant and you want to maybe reach out about what their evidence is, so to keep that record visible. And our goal is to focus on really obvious issues that don't require deep formal variant classification that we reserve for our expert panels. So we're mostly looking for records that have at least 2 things going on. They're old, outlier, or lack of supporting evidence. So just one of those, just because something's old doesn't mean it's wrong. Just because it's an outlier doesn't mean it's wrong. Just because the fact that it annoys me, just because they didn't put their evidence doesn't mean it's wrong. On the other hand, if it's both old and an outlier, it's much more likely to be not up to date. If it's an outlier and they didn't provide any evidence, well, you know what? Come on, you got to provide your evidence if you're going to say something that's different than everyone else. So, you can see how combining at least 2 of these starts to, question a record's likelihood of being accurate. So we, and by we, Larry Babb, really built this little Chrome extension tool, which is brilliant. So every time I or one of the ClinGen curators working on this project opens up ClinVar, we have a little C up in our browser. And if we push that button, up comes this little tool that you see on the right. And it's just sitting on top of the ClinVar screen. And for whatever record I'm on, when I open this tool, all of the SCVs show up and I can just scroll down, click one and say, that's the record I want to flag. And then we have a drop down menu of why are you flagging? Okay, moving on. Advance, there we go. So for this project, we did a pilot because we wanted to get a sense of the community's reaction to us marking people's submissions and flagging them and making them not count. People might be annoyed about that. So we sent SCV submissions proposed for flagging to labs to get feedback before this actually went into production. And so we flagged 201 SCVs, returned them to 20 labs. We did about 10 per lab. And the labs actually agreed with our flagging for most of the records, 94% of them. And we also asked, if we sent you these flagged, do the curation, we send a monthly list of these. FACMG then processes that list. They do their own QC of it. Things like, has that record already been updated since we curated it, in which case that flag does not get applied. So they'll do their processing, then they'll send out the SCVs to each submitter that has any, and those submitters have 60 days if they wish to intervene and update their record or challenge the flag. If they say we don't agree with this, that message gets sent back to our team. We'll look at it and then we'll either provide a rationale or I'll show and later we've actually rejected a couple of flags based on those feedbacks. So if there's no response, then after 60 days, those records are flagged. They no longer contribute to the overall classification. But as I said before, that record remains accessible. They're in the bottom section of the submission list, and I'll show that in a second. However, if a submitter then at any point in the future updates that record and the version of the SCV therefore changes, that flag gets automatically removed, or it's not placed if that comes in before the 60 days. And then there's a log that we keep for feedback from submitters, so we get a sense of sort of what's happening over time and learn from the whole process. Okay, is there another question in the chat? Thanks. Got it. Okay, so this is, if you haven't seen these in ClinVar, this is an example of what the screen looks like. So at the very bottom, those records have this flagged submission orange thing, and then it will give the reason. And so these are some of the structured reasons that we have. Outlier claim with insufficient supporting evidence is one of our tags. And then if we've done it, it'll say ClinGen. I think there's a few of these that ClinVar actually addresses. So a source could be ClinVar itself. I don't think there's any others besides ClinGen and ClinVar that are doing this. So that's a sense of how this might look. Okay, or does look. All right, so what have we done to date? So we have a little dashboard that Larry built for us. So at any point in time, we can see how many records have been looked at. So what you're seeing on this left grid is the number of SCV submission records that in total that have been looked at. So a little over 10,000 records. And then of those, how many did someone in our team flag as a flagging candidate? That's what the FC is. A flagging candidate that gets sent to ClinVar. And then if there's no intervention, then it becomes flagged. But so these are the number of things that we've marked as flagging candidates and sent to ClinVar. Now, if you look at that at the variant levels, how many variant overall records have had been looked at, that's 8,348, of which 3,262 records have had at least one flagging candidate on that variant record flagged. And then you can, on the right, I just put the monthly stats so you get a sense of kind of the ebbs and flows of our work over time. the light blue is the flagging candidates versus those records that got no, we call it no change. I looked at it, it wasn't appropriate to flag, and I moved on. We actually mark those to say, looked at it, no flag or no change. So we don't keep doing the same ones over and over. And then both at the SCV level and the BCV level. Okay. Next slide. So then this is actually a list of all of the structured reasons that we flag something, and rough and in order how many are getting what tag. So the vast majority of the reason is that there is an outlier claim with insufficient supporting evidence. So it's like they're the only one that says X, and they did not provide any rationale or very limited rationale for why they are different than everyone else. Then going down the list, actually, as I was assembling these slides, I was like, that's a lot of other, which triggered me to say, go back and see whether we need to come up with a new term for these records that have other, but right now there are 500 that don't meet any of these categories. 437 were both older and outlier claim with insufficient, like sort of all three. And then 429 that were just a claim with insufficient supporting evidence causing a conflict. Although it is not sufficient just to have no evidence. At the same time, if there's really good, well rationalized other entries and it's in conflict with a couple others and you provided no evidence, we will kind of flag some of those just to in part say, please submit your evidence and tell us why you're calling this, because it's not useful to anybody in the community just to disagree. And so sometimes if you just provide nothing at all, we may be more likely to flag things for that reason. And then 266, older claim that does not account for recent evidence. And again, that's not us trying to go in and do a formal variant classification. It's like a bunch of references and PubMed IDs were there. And you can see that an older claim does not reference any of these new papers. So like things that are a little bit more obvious to see that they're not accounting for recent evidence, but not necessarily like formally classifying the variant. That this goal is to be quite quick with this process and not having to use professional judgment, really. And then conflicts with expert reviewed submission. So even though these aren't creating overall conflicts, we do ask our expert panels to look at records that are conflicting with theirs. And so we take the time to actually get rid of records if there's no clear reason why they are in conflict, so that our expert panels don't have to kind of dig into those. And then this is that one I mentioned, unnecessary conflicting claim for a distinct condition when other classifications are more relevant. That goes back to some of the guidance we've come out with. And then other submission errors that happened in submission, we actually think there's an error going on, and that's why the submission is what it is. And then subset, new submission from submitter that appears to have been intended to update the older submission and something went wrong. And then I actually thought I had seen a bunch of these, but it's not a common reason. So sometimes groups will interpret a variant and say it's VUS because their patient's phenotype doesn't match the condition. That's not how you're supposed to do it. I actually am happy to see that's very rarely happening these days. Used to be a bigger issue. Okay, so that gives you a sense of sort of the different reasons why things are getting flagged and relative ratios.
There's a couple of questions in the chat. I wonder if you want to tackle Jasmine's now, and then I think you might be getting to Lucy's question in a moment anyway.
All right, what happens to records that are flagged, but the submitting laboratory is no longer in operation, so the records cannot, are these marked in any way in ClinVar? Yeah, so that's a good of submissions from Emory. It's under Eurofins, because that's who bought them out before they were closed down. Those records will never be updated. And so this is actually a mechanism to deal with that. But however, there's no distinction between this is a lab that went out of business and it's not expected to ever be updated versus this a lab that still exists out there, because there's so many gradations in between. You know, a lab may still be around, but they just aren't in a position to manage their submissions. That maybe it's a research group that submitted a bunch of entries from a publication, but they're not even working in that field anymore, but they still exist as a research lab. So we don't differentiate those reasons, but they're all flagged if they aren't addressed during that 60-day period. Does insufficient supporting evidence mean the submitter did not want to provide the evidence, whether they do not have supporting evidence? So we don't actually know the answer to that. It's just blank, right? We all know the ClinVar submissions where there's a classification and there's no evidence, no references, no codes, no text, no anything. Whether it's that I would say, having interacted with a lot of these groups myself as a ClinVar user, it's rarely the case they don't want to share. It's more the case that their database is such that those nice structured evidence or text summaries don't exist in a way to put them in ClinVar, or the resources required to do so. So usually people are willing, they just, for whatever reason, haven't done it. That's what I find to be most the case, but we obviously don't know that at the end that we're working on until we communicate. Okay, I think I addressed both those. Great, good questions. Okay, moving on. So just a sense of like, is there one big submitter that's gotten most of the flags, or are they spread all over? So the answer is they're spread all over. So as of yesterday, there were 2,901 ClinVar submitters. 11% of them have flagged records. Now that may seem a smaller percentage, but keep in mind there's a massive number of submitters that have submitted 10 or fewer records. So like most submitters that have substantial submissions have at least one flag. So this is a lot of submitters. Now, what matters is like your percent of your records, because like I could say X lab has the most flag records, but they probably also have the most submissions. So it's not relevant, right? I would say, or the top 50 largest submitters of ClinVar all have fewer than 1.5% of records flagged. There's no need to give actual submitter names, but this is just like on the scale of up to 1.5% of records of the top 50 I'm showing here. You know, they all have a bunch of these. And the one that I called out actually was an example of a lab that went out of business, that their last submission was 2019. So it's no surprise that they have a higher rate of flagged records. So 29 labs have more than 20 records flagged. The highest lab is 377 in terms of the number of flagged submissions. But again, those are from some of these businesses that have went out of business and they're not updating records. 48 labs have greater than 5% of records flagged, 11 of which have more than 20 submissions. So there is a small number of labs that there have been some challenges with. One submitter, actually, we flagged 85% of the records. And that was a situation where there was a huge bucket of conflicting things that we looked into and then discovered that they weren't really submitting and interpreting variants correctly. And we ended up investigating their entire submission of about 200 or so and felt that most of them weren't appropriately classified. And we communicated with that lab and trying to educate. So that's a rare, very rare event. There's one case where there's a really high number, but we use this as an opportunity to educate and teach around variant classification as well. So I think that's a useful, activity. Now I mentioned the labs have the opportunity to come back to us and say, we disagree with your flagging. So we have received questions on 21 of the 4,000 records that were flagged and sent out. That's from the 21 questions came from 17 labs. And of those, 6 flags were actually reversed. So 2 were actually human error. You saw that Chrome extension tool with all of the records. It's there were twice that just the wrong SCV was clicked in that. It can happen, human error. So we actually reversed those two. They were just human error. And then 4 were changed after some discussion. Although the goal here is to not have to use a lot of professional judgment, there is sometimes judgment used, and sometimes there's disagreement, and we listen to people. I come in and review every one of those where somebody has objected and weigh in on that. So we have reversed 6, but I'm happy that of the 4,000, only 21 questions arisen and only actually 6 flags were reversed. So I think overall we're hitting it reasonably okay on this decision-making process around flagging, and the community has been pretty appreciative and supportive of kind of where we're sitting with this activity. So then, of course, my overall goal of this project is actually to resolve the conflicts through this method with a much easier, quicker way than all the work of an expert panel. And so we now have a dashboard that shows how many conflicts were resolved. So where at least one SCV review. So the outcome is that the conflict was resolved for 82% of the conflicting variants that we looked at. So that's actually pretty good. And this is a little detail from our dashboard on the right. So sometimes the conflict is fully resolved. That was the 2071. Sometimes the conflict is modified. So like one record that's in conflict may have been flagged, but another one wasn't sufficient to flag and meet the criteria, so it's modified. Or maybe it's we got rid of a benign entry, but it's still in conflict based on a VUS to path, likely path. Or we got rid of the path. This is actually more likely. It was path, VUS, and benign. We got rid of the path, but the VUS, likely benign conflict, the non-medically significant, still remained. And as many of you can appreciate, threading the needle on the VUS versus likely benign is a much more difficult exercise with a lot of lab specific sort of rules that are difficult to professionally judge. So we mostly actually don't address that whole bucket for that reason. So sometimes we resolve the big conflict of the pathogenic claim, but not the whole record. And then there's a subset that are actually never in conflict to begin with. And so there's no conflict to resolve. But I'm going to give an example of why we even would look at a record that's not in conflict. So this is an example. I became aware when the TRDN gene was added to the secondary findings return, and lots of labs started to interpret variants in this gene that didn't always have deep expertise in that gene. Turns out the main select transcript for this particular gene has 41 exons, but most of those exons are not expressed in cardiac tissue and have no relevance to the cardiac disease associated with this gene. So a lot of labs with deep expertise in this gene know that, and they only classify the variants here on this gene, by the way, is reversed. So on the right are exons 1 through 8. That's where all the pathogenic variants are. But we could see that some labs were classifying loss of function variants as likely path out there where they're actually not relevant to pathogenicity for the condition. So I went into all of those variants and flagged them, and then gave the detailed rationale for the fact that these are not expressed, that transcripts not expressed in cardiac tissue. So that's an example. There was no conflict, but they were just not appropriate. Now, interestingly, that's then going to lead this, if that was the only submission in ClinVar for that variant, all of a sudden now the overall record changes to no classifications from unflagged records, right? Because literally that was the only variant in there for that particular record. So you might not have ever seen that before, but that now can happen because of this mechanism. Okay. So getting now on to thinking about VCEPs, right? So actually very early on when we had proposed this project, and there were some, particularly on our ESP, naysayers who didn't think this was worth our time, we actually did a pilot before we had any of these tools worked out to just say, like, what would the benefit of this project be for our VCEPs? And so we had members of our, we actually started with the Broad-Geisinger, sorry, that should say VCEPs, not, oh, no, we assessed from 14 Gs. I think that should say VCEPs. Oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. There's a separate project that we've been doing before I get to the VCEP project. And that is, we have lots of GCEPs assessing genes and marking certain genes limited, refuted, or disputed. So you should not be calling a variant pathogenic if the gene has not been implicated in disease, right? So actually, we've been looking at records for genes marked limited, disputed, or refuted to then dispute the classification as path, likely path. So we tackled 7,000 records across 5 different clinical domains that our team has worked on, encompassing 130 genes, and reviewed all those records. And the outcome of that was there were 614 SCVs that were examined and been able to flag based on the gene level being disputed, refuted, limited. So you can see 460 were from limited genes, 18 from disputed, 11 from refuted. There was a few that we didn't mark a change. That was either because the curator was looking at the record and realizing there might be new evidence for that gene. And therefore they didn't necessarily flag it if it looked like, the gene curation might have been older or things like that. A few other reasons in that category. Okay, so that's that. Now I mentioned here that anyone can submit a request. So on the ClinGen website, if you go to the curation activities here, at the bottom is ClinGen Curation of ClinVar. So we have a website for this project. So if you find errors in ClinVar, you can just click on this request review. It opens up a form. You paste in the SCV and maybe your name or email and submit it to us. And then we look at it. So that's the process. So what's been submitted to us so far? So we've gotten 38 requests from 11 individuals, 1 to 16 per person. Most were valid requests, and we went in and addressed them. And for those who submit many requests that we agree with, which has so far been pretty much true, we may actually reach out to you and say, if you're taking all this time to submit all these variants into this form, maybe we should train you and teach you and let you use the Chrome extension directly. And we actually did that with Audrey O'Neill from Ambry. She's now been trained by our team. And now she, instead of submitting them all through the form, she just marks them herself. So you too may be able to join our team. So we do, now I'm going to move to where I thought I was talking about before, is the VCEPs. Right. So we asked VCEPs to prioritize, and this is on the website, that you should prioritize those conflicting variants. Right. And many of you may be using the VCEP tracker reports that give you all your lists of variants that are in conflict. And some of you probably have very long lists of conflicting variants that are going to take you a long time. So this is an opportunity to actually engage with us and actually use this method to get rid of some of these conflicts before you guys spend time on your much more difficult variants that need expert input. So if your VCEP wants to do some pre-curation to address these easy conflicts, or just pause and do some of this, or do it in parallel, we did demonstrate some of the utilities in some early pilot projects. So Marina and the hearing loss group had done an assessment of 100 conflicting variants, and 41 of those were flagged that we were using non-contributory before, but now they're flagged. And so the total curation time, the sort of take-home message, is it took 3 hours to review 100 variants, about 2 minutes per variant. So think about that and compare it to the amount of time our biocurators spend in teeing up variants and researching variants for expert consensus. So it just really speaks to that. Aaron Riggs was involved in the Rhett Angelman, again, took 99 minutes to review 36 variant records, 3 minutes per variant. And again, this is back when we didn't even have like the infrastructure to support this project. And you can see of all of these conflicting variants here, most of them were resolved to actual classifications. So, so the overall impact was of this pilot way back when was 2 to 3 minutes to curate compared to roughly 7 variants per month for VCEPs. So this is worth your while if you're involved in a VCEP. So with that, I'm going to actually stop, acknowledge the whole team that's been working on this project. Our curators, I actually added in the number of records they've curated. So you can see Julie and Annabella have done a ton of these. This is Audrey, who we brought into the process from Ambry, and then Vanessa and Eric. We've been, as I mentioned, this project has all been done in close connection with the ClinVar team, Melissa, Kuljit, many others, and then Larry and team have been working on all of the dashboards and reports and tools and stuff that supports it. So I just want to thank the whole team for this project. I'm going to stop there. I see there's some more questions in the chat, which I'll open up. Can you put the link for the VCEP tracker slides in the chat? Yes, actually, I can do that. And you have a few minutes left for this meeting. Oh, is that? Oh, that's the AI person. Okay.
Very helpful assistant.
Yes, I can both share these slides in general, and I think I also put a link to the tracker slide deck that this might not be the most recent one. I think Danielle might have shown this one because I saw it was from 2003, but I'll at least put the one I found in Google Docs slide deck here, that one right now. So Ashini.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you for this awesome presentation. This might be a wild idea, but have you considered using maybe AI tools to kind of train what you're looking for in the text of the evidence to kind of flag SCVs to kind of speed up the process?
Yeah, possibly. And actually, we were just having a chat in our Slack channel this morning. I think it was members of the Baylor team that developed kind of an algorithm to assess. So for example, you can imagine a record that has 30 pathogenic claims and then an old VUS claim, that example I gave before. Like the likelihood that you can just get rid of that VUS claim from 10 years ago, like, is very high, right? So she developed sort of an algorithm to give a score for the and convert these to a high likelihood that the record is actually pathogenic, and you're ignoring based on how many are in disagreement and how old those things in disagreement are. So that's not AI, it's more just like a basic algorithm, right? Now I think the question around could you use AI to review the evidence? Possibly. Like, we are looking at, does each record include the same PubMed IDs, for example? Does an older record not include PubMed IDs? I will say that would work great if people included, references in very structured format in the same way. Not always the case. So I think it's definitely worthy of an area of exploration to try to do that. So yeah, potentially. I think right now it's just having the resources to do that sort of AI work. But if you or anyone else is interested in exploring that, happy to consider it.
Yeah, I think I am in the Baylor group, and I had developed. I'm working a lot with ClinVar data, and so I developed that sort of algorithm. It might have been me, but yeah. So I was going based off of like simple programming to like give a score and try to get rid of the conflicts. But now that I was listening to the presentation and you're going manually and actually reading the evidence, I thought maybe it might be useful to use like an AI tool, and we'll be happy to. I'm interested in helping out if I can in any way.
Yeah, I think we were just discussing that your tool, thinking the question is whether it's slightly better prioritization tool to tell us what variants to start with, because they're very highly likely to be flagged, right? Now, we have a similar prioritization system that uses exactly how much of an outlier is it? Is it 1 in 50 or is it 1 out of 3? Right. And so we can easily prioritize the 1 in 50 records to look at versus, and we also can quickly see the dates of those records and things like that. That said, we're not bringing together both the outlier and the date in a consolidated algorithm to rank those. So we were talking about maybe it's a slightly better process to prioritize than what we have right now. At the same time, we are trying to support the VCEPs, in which case we're just doing all of their conflicting records and there's no need to prioritize them. So I think I'm not sure it would add a lot of yield over our current prioritization method, but it might add some. I think the real question is, would an AI process literally remove any need for manual review? And that, could definitely add value potentially. Yes, thanks for that work.
And then there was one other question in the chat from Jasmine around, would you recommend this for all VCEPs in regards to reviewing conflicting classifications in ClinVar?
100% recommend it. We did have, I don't know if Julie's on, we did have one recent group where it just happened to be an area where there weren't a lot of old conflicting variants for the genes that they were working on, and it didn't have nearly as much impact. I think where there's likely to be impact are genes that have been around for a while, with a huge diversity of labs testing the gene or, evaluating variants in those genes. And so you're likely to have much older, records, as well as records submitted before there were good guidelines, records submitted by labs that aren't submitting any evidence. So there's definitely, certain genes that you end up with a lot of things getting flagged regularly, and then other genes that kind of don't fit the kind of likelihood of getting a lot of wrong records. But I would, if I was a VCEP, I would absolutely do this as a first step, because anything you can get rid of in 2 minutes per variant is going to be so much easier than how long it takes us all to do these, expert consensus process. Any other questions? Thanks, Danielle. So I will, I did my slides in PowerPoint, but I will convert them to a PDF, and then I presume, Alicia, someone can just send it out as an attachment for so people have the whole slide deck.
Yes, easy. So this whole meeting is recorded and it goes up on our YouTube channel. So when we're sending out the link to this specific recording afterwards, we'll also send out the attachment, and perhaps we can put the attachment for it in the YouTube notes part, if you're happy for us to be sharing the slide deck there as well.
Yes, absolutely. Sounds
excellent.
Great. Just converting it to a PDF right now. If anybody needs the actual PowerPoint slides, happy to share those as well. They just too big to email.
When you said that there's a link for this on the ClinGen website, so under the curation activities, and you can navigate to the form to request variants for review.
Yep.
This is perhaps a controversial question. Is there anything on the ClinVar website that alerts people to the fact that they can navigate to that form to report a variant?
Yep, there is. So I just need to find it. I know there is. Excellent question of where it is. Huh.
At least put a link to the blog post they posted, but I will, like Heidi, have to keep looking for where it is at the documentation.
Yeah, I actually can't seem to find it. It is definitely there somewhere. So Thank you, Danielle, for putting the blog post. So maybe we'll bring that up with ClinVar at our next call, that it's not obvious where that is.
You know what? In the blog post, they do link to it. They have it's in their help documentation that they link to from the blog where they talk about our process and link back to our website.
Yes, there it is. Problematic.
Because certainly for how often you hear people say, oh, ClinVar's got so many variants in there, it's hard to filter through to work out what's a good classification and what's just junk. I wish there was a way to report that. The fact that you've only had, what, 36, 40 submissions, I know that's not been long that you've had that.
Submit. It's actually not very complicated, but being aware that they can do that and knowing how to do that, taking the time. Yeah. I think most are just hoping that we get to all these records eventually.
Find them. Yeah. Okay, well, we only have 5 minutes left. If there's not any further questions, we might let people have a few moments back to the end of their day. But thank you so much for that presentation today, Heidi, for what is a very cool and very meaningful, has a lot of utility, this project. So thank you for the update. And we will meet again as a Biocurator working group on the 24th of October. And like I said, there is that luncheon at ASHG for people who will be there. So we'll send out the RSVP link for that as well as soon as that's available. With that, thank you. I hope you have great evenings.
All right. Take care, everyone.